I want to bring information to people who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. Like, that's my whole goal with this channel. My entire goal is for you guys to be able to learn stuff that usually is locked behind a ridiculous paywall. Like, I love teaching it. I love when people learn things about themselves. Like, that's the cool thing about knowing stuff about psychology, is we get to learn stuff about ourselves. Like, what we're going to talk about today is literally stuff that happens in your brain. And what happens when you're presented with a situation that violates your expectations, and why it's so important for us to do something about the expectations we have of the world. So today, what we are going to talk about are schemas. We're going to talk about inconsistency, compensation. Under the umbrella of that, what we're going to talk about is what's something that's called aversive arousal. And then we're going to talk about how these two things link to trauma and how it helps us understand how trauma works for a person and why they respond to a trauma in the way that they do. All right. And I'm going to do this by providing certain examples and walking you through how this gets sequenced out. So that, and this is something, like, I can tell you right now, this is something that relates to every single person sitting here. So all of you, this is something, no matter who you are, this is something that is going to speak to your experience in some way, which is why I think this is so cool. For a little bit of context on this, so my PhD is in human development. I learned most of this actually on my own through developing my lectures for my human development class that I taught in a master's program. So I taught a human development course in a master's program at Northwestern University when I was an assistant professor. And I did a lot of work around this lecture in trying to prepare the class in a way that I thought was going to be meaningful and really was going to change their therapy. So that's where this comes from. If anybody's new here and you're wondering who the hell is this guy and why is he qualified to talk about it, that's why. I know it pretty well. And I'm very confident in my ability to talk about it. So here we go. Let's do it, huh? Shall we? The first thing that we are going to need to talk about here are what are called schemas. So when you go through the world, think about when you're a little kid. When you're a little kid and you come out into the world, you have absolutely no understanding of the way that the world works. When a child looks at this, like a little 2-year-old child looks at this, that child does not see a pop can. It doesn't see bubbly. It doesn't see branding. They don't see a pop tab. They don't break it down into its parts. They just see this thing that they've never seen before and have no idea what it is. That also goes for grass. It goes for a house, a guitar, bracelet, a hat, all this stuff. Like, we come into this world not having any understanding of what any of this shit is. And so when a little kid is walking around or crawling around and they're touching everything, they're putting it in their mouth, they're looking at it, they're smelling it. What a child's doing is building a very simplistic foundation for understanding the world. And the way that we have to do that over time is by categorizing the world or creating schemas. Okay? So here's a really easy test of a schema that some of you have. What are these? What is this? Okay. Now, stuff to chew on. Okay. Right. So we have headphones. We have controller. Now, what I love is Jared said earmuffs, which somebody could have said. Okay. But how do you know that? Well, you know that because your brain has created what's called a schema for a thing called headphones, which is when you see something with these big circles like this that go over a person's ears and have a thing that connects it like this with a little wire that comes out of it. We have categorized that thing as being headphones. Very easy to do, right? So when you walk into Best Buy or Micro Center or something like that, and you walk down an aisle and you see a bunch of these, you say, I'm in the headphone aisle. These are all headphones. I can reasonably assume that when I put this on my ears, there's going to be sound that comes out of it, and it's going to connect to whatever device I have, et cetera, et cetera. Makes it very easy for you to walk through the store. Now, just imagine for a second, just imagine that every single time you saw these or something that looked like it, like here, I'm gonna give you an example. Hold on one second. Let's say that when I came over here and I said, okay, yeah, so what are these then? If your brain never categorized or made a schema out of what a headphone is or a headset is, you would have to completely rediscover this every single time somebody showed you this. Now, you all would say like these are headphones, even though these are Astros, these are Sennheisers. They're not entirely the same technology. They don't use the same like padding. They're not built exactly the same. But because they reasonably fit the description that your brain has created about what a headphone is, you've categorized it. If I would have come over here and just done this, you wouldn't have struggled to understand what it is at all because it would have made sense to you because this is basically the same thing. You wouldn't have freaked out. You might have noticed that there was a difference in the way the headset looked, but ultimately you know it's a headset. Now, if it feels like I'm overly belaboring this, it's because I really want to drive home the point that we do this with everything. Everything. Okay? Our brain is constantly trying to categorize the world because it makes it easier for us to walk through it, and we don't have to think so hard about things. I can reasonably understand what it is. Like if I pick this up and you couldn't quite see what it is and I'm doing it, like you know it's a phone, so you're not going to freak out about it. So it is. It's like a file folder of things in the world. If you think about your brain that way, it's a great way to do it, man. All right? So we actually have, like, there are different types of schemas. I'm not going to go into all of them, but we have what are called person schemas. We have social schemas. We have self schemas. We have event schemas. Right? And we just have, I kind of call it stuff schemas or object schemas. All of these are different types of schemas that we create in the world. Person schemas being the way that we understand things like appearance, personalities, behaviors, etc. So we tend to, like, you'll see people respond to this by saying, like, I'm this type of person, right? If you're into astrology, this would be an example of a person schema in some ways. Like I'm an Aquarius would be like a person schema because then it creates this whole idea of what a person is based on their astrology. When we talk about Harry Potter houses, if I say I'm a Slytherin, all of a sudden you know something about me that you might not have known before, right? Also, if I say, I'm white, I'm cisgender, I'm straight, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Chicago. All these things are person schemas. All of a sudden, your brain can very quickly categorize me. Very simply. I'm a therapist. One of the things that happens a lot is I break a lot of people's schema about what a therapist is because I've not seen many therapists that, dress like this. All right, but we have a schema for what all these things look like. These are the ways, basically, these are objects that are represented in our head, makes it easy to file things away. Another way to think about this is our schemas equal our expectations. And this is going to be really important here in a second. All right, that when we have these schemas, they construct our expectations for how things in the future are going to work. And we love it. We love it when our schemas are accurate. Because when schemas are accurate, it's calming. And we actually are then in a state called equilibrium. And we are human beings, most living things, are comfortable when we have like a mental equilibrium or homeostasis, where I, for the most part, am moving through the world in a way that is consistent with my schemas and my expectations. Very easy for me to know that when I look at this is a computer screen. This is a piece of paper with my notes on it. This is a pop can. I'm in a home. My expectation of my home is that it's safe. This is a wallet. All these types of things, right? So I don't have to think much about it. I don't experience this novelty with every single thing I come across. Because holy shit, would it be debilitating if we had to do that. Our brain, it's a great question, Mia. Our brain absolutely wants to be in equilibrium. Because, to expand on this just a little bit further, equilibrium equals safety. And so you have to think about, and from an evolutionary perspective, you have to think about this. That if we're experiencing equilibrium, if we can predict our environment, if our schemas are accurate, if our expectations are correct, theoretically, we're safe. We're not at risk. We don't have things that we can't anticipate. So our brain wants equilibrium because it can perceive the world, it can perceive its surroundings as being safe, thus we're not at risk, thus we're stable, thus we're cool. And we don't have to sit at this really strong baseline of anxiety. Because all anxiety is, as I've mentioned before, is just a risk mitigating emotion. We're going to actually talk about how anxiety shows up in this, but I really want to make sure I hammered home the point of how this works. As a addition to this, equilibrium is when our expectations align with our experiences. Okay? So I read the weather report last night that said that today in Chicago was going to be partly cloudy, but mostly sunny. That's what it is today. You can't see it very well out my window, but that's what it is. Super easy, right? I walked outside and went, that's exactly what I was expecting. Feels good. Didn't think much about the weather. Now, if I had come out this morning after being told it was going to be partly cloudy and 72 degrees, and I walked out here and it was snowing and 20 degrees, might not have liked that. Might not have loved that because my expectations let me down and my experience didn't align. And I'm going to give way more examples of this in a second, but just want to make sure that you all understand kind of where I'm going with this. So person schemas, would stereotypes be similar to schemas? Yes. So stereotypes are an oversimplified version of a schema, or they are a schema. All right. So yes, if you have a stereotype that, if I was Canadian, there's a stereotype that Canadians apologize all the time. All right. They always say sorry. And then if you met a Canadian that didn't do that, it might violate your expectation based on a stereotype that you have. So, yes, stereotypes are, at their core, if we take value judgment out of it, stereotypes at their core are just schemas. That's all they are. They're schemas that are overly simplified, and they put people into boxes. They're often the result of a lack of diverse representation as well. An example of a person's schema that I myself had to break through as a kid is, so I grew up in Northwest Indiana, where it's like 98% white, like very little diversity in the community I grew up in. Very little. And really the only time I ever saw black people represented was on the news. And the news, as many of you know, in the United States tends to portray black people as thugs or always getting in trouble or whatnot. And so I grew up with a bias based on that, because the only representation I had ever had of black Americans is that they're dealing drugs or they're getting in trouble or they're causing problems, because that's the only exposure I ever had. So I had a schema that that's what black people are like. This is how racism happens. Okay. So I was inherently racist because I came from a super racist, well, not even an overtly racist community, but one where there was little representation. And so first time I go out into the world, into college, and all of a sudden now, like, I'm surrounded by a diverse body of people, I'm operating off my schemas, but I constantly was having experiences that weren't aligning with that. Because as you all know, there's overwhelming majority of black people are not that. Okay. And I also had white people represented as good. All right. So this is how racism develops. This is how isms develop, because we create schemas that we then firmly clutch to. And we're going to talk about how that happens here in a minute. So if you've been trying to understand some of the current event stuff that's going on too, this lecture is going to touch on that a little bit. You know, I prefer to use the term expectation as opposed to schemas, because schemas just inform our expectations. They help create our expectations for the world. And we continually take those and we reinforce those schemas. Schemas get reinforced over time. And as schemas get reinforced over time, they become stronger and they become harder for us to detach ourselves from. This is kind of, again, this is all the way in which we're primed to create expectations for our world. These schemas are reinforced by the environment, which includes other people and also includes like our cognitive biases. Schemas can be wrong. Yes, they can. Well, actually, so here's the thing about schemas. It's not necessarily that they're wrong. I want to backtrack for a second. Schemas are not inherently right or wrong. Schemas sit on a spectrum of simple to complex. All right. We have kind of the spectrum here. When we are first introduced to a thing and first create a schema, it is simple. You might even argue that it is oversimplified. Okay. As I gave the example of people, or like, let's say a guitar. If the only guitars I'd ever seen in my entire life were Stratocasters, I would assume that if I assumed all guitars are Stratocasters, that's an oversimplified schema of what a guitar is. And then all of a sudden, if I see a Les Paul body shape, now all of a sudden I have to slowly kind of expand my understanding of what a guitar is and can look like. Now, oversimplified schemas, somewhat to address your point here, Canuck, oversimplified have a higher likelihood of being incorrect or misrepresentations. And this should make sense because you don't have a full breadth of understanding of a given thing. You haven't diversified your schema. So if you're operating from an overly simplified schema, there's a great chance that you're going to be wrong when you meet somebody. If I assumed that the next, let's say, if I assumed that the next therapist I met was going to be emotionally available, and then they weren't, I have now created kind of an inaccurate expectation for that person. I use these terms very purposefully, because we don't want to place value judgment on these schemas, because as soon as we do that, we start bashing people for their schemas. It's really important to understand that this is how it starts. This is entirely how it starts. When I started streaming, I had a very oversimplified understanding of streaming. I had never watched Twitch before I started streaming on it. So I had this oversimplified idea of how it worked. I had no idea the complexity that went into trying to run a stream. All right, so my oversimplified expectation of how Twitch streaming was going to work created a whole set of issues for me that I've had to work through progressively over the last 2 years. This happens with everything: events, people, social exchanges, whatnot. If you think a social interaction is this very simple give and take, there's a good chance that you've oversimplified the representation of a social interaction in your head. Thus, you're more likely to open yourself up to being incorrect or misrepresenting what that social situation could be. All right. So what we need to do as humans is we want to take our schemas from simple to complex. We are generally better off moving into a space where we have a more complex and diverse range of understanding of how a given schema will work. We're going to talk about how we do this in a minute. All right, so this over here leads to nuance. It takes into account context, right? You have an increased likelihood to be correct, though you never have a perfect chance of being correct. And you have a more accurate representation. All right. Now, as you're watching this, one of the things that you might be thinking is like, well, that's great. Then I want to go make my schemas more complex. And I'm here to tell you, and it's just good for you to know, I'm here to tell you that the older you get, the harder it is to do. This sounds easy, but it's not easy because of what happens in our brain, and that's what's going to take us to the next part here. But before I do that, I want to make sure that everybody's clear on how this works and how schemas are before I go into the next point, because if I've lost you here, the rest of this lecture is going to completely lose you. Here's the process whereby we understand and interpret the world. All right. So you walk outside. You're having a good old time. You have expectations founded on your cognitive schemas. Those expectations just kind of hang out with you. You just have them. We all do, inherently. Then what happens is we have an experience. All right, which means something happens. So you hit the sky, you interact with somebody, you do something. I pick up my guitar and I strum it, whatever it might be. All right, I'll give you an example. I pick up my guitar here. I make the shape that is a G chord. I would expect this to be a G when I play it. So when I go like this, I would expect that it's going to be a G. If I play this and a C comes out, I've just had an experience that violates my expectation. So there's two things that can happen here. And I'm going to branch it this way. The first chance that we have is that our experience is going to align with that expectation. If that happens, then this reinforces that expectation. Easy peasy, move through your day. I expected a G chord, I strummed a G chord played, easy, reinforced. Schema thus is reinforced by that. We experience equilibrium. All right, remember that word. This is what equilibrium is. This whole sequence right here is equilibrium. That is what our brain wants every day, all day, every day. Just inject that shit in my veins. Give me equilibrium. I want it. Because again, equilibrium is safe. Equilibrium means we're cool. Alrighty. Now, let's imagine you go out into the world and you have a given expectation and it does not align. That's not how you spell align. I expected myself to spell align properly. I did not spell align properly. This is where we enter a whole new zone. All right, so if I go to play that G chord and a C comes out, now all of a sudden we have what's called aversive arousal, otherwise known as anxiety. We experience aversive arousal as anxiety. This is also one form of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance takes two major forms. Cognitive dissonance is when our experiences do not align with our expectations, and it's also holding two conflicting ideas at the same time. Those are the two major ways we think about cognitive dissonance, both of which are incredibly uncomfortable for our brain. Our brain hates it because our brain connects this as being risky. So the example that I always use when I do this, because I think it's really easy for people to understand, is here's you. You're happy. You just woke up. You walk over to your window.
Supplies allocated. Uploading coordinates.
And you look outside. And you look up at the sky. My friends, what color are you going to expect that the sky is going to be? You're going to assume white. Generally, one of two things. The sky is either going to be blue, or perhaps the sky is going to be gray. Perhaps the sky is going to be black because it's dark, right? Blue, gray, maybe pink, depending on what time you've woken up. Like, that's cool. Maybe a little orange. Perfectly reasonable colors for us to expect the sky is based on whatever time it is, right? Now, let's imagine you wake up, you look up in the sky, and the sky is purple. Just straight purple, like as purple as what's on this screen right now. Tell me what you'd think. Ooh, we're on Venus. That would be weird. Aliens. Twitch is taking over the world. When did I last take acid? I'm talking like the whole sky is just purple like that. All right. It'd be right. So what's so beautiful right now is what you guys are doing in chat is the next step of this sequence, which is our brain goes into inconsistency compensation. So you would assume I'm bored. So all of a sudden, you are having an experience that is not aligning with your expectations. There's going to be a level of anxiety that's going to pop up just because of the fact that this is an experience that's in complete violation to this. And now what all of you are typing in chat is your form of inconsistency compensation, which is basically what your brain does to try to compensate for the dissonance that it's experiencing. You were expecting, when you looked out your window, one of the colors you would technically see when you look at the sky, and all of a sudden it's as purple as the Twitch banner. Your brain's going to do everything it can to try to create an experience because it wants to diminish this aversive arousal and get you back to equilibrium. The whole goal of what your brain's doing here is trying to get you back here. And there are different ways in which we do this. And we're going to talk about those ways now. We're going to talk about the 4 A's. I would fear some unknown nuclear plant melted down. Right. Okay. So now before I go to the next part, I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to give you guys another hypothetical. So you go throughout your day. It's purple the whole way through. And you go to bed. And when you wake up the next day, you walk outside and it's purple again in the same way that it was the day before. And let's imagine that for the next 2 weeks, when you look up at the sky is purple. I'm talking as purple as my chair. What would you do? What would you think? God, I love this. This is why I use this hypothetical. I love it so much. I might want to have my eyes checked. Maybe I guess the sky's purple now. New normal. Either accept or see a doctor. What am I unaware of? Oh man, I love it. I love it so much. I would try to rationalize it. Exactly. So now all of a sudden, when it's become a pattern, we're looking at different types of inconsistency compensation. And so I want you to think about what your 2 answers were to this, whether you answered them in chat or whether I've just been sitting here thinking about it or watching it. And we're going to talk about this because this is a fascinating thing that our brain does, all in the spirit of trying to lessen the aversive arousal that we experience when we have cognitive dissonance, when our experience doesn't align with our expectations. Tweet about it, ask my friends. Oh, God, okay, I love this. This is where I get jazzed, man. This is where I get jazzed, because this is where you're going to all understand some human behavior, and it's really fabulous stuff. In here, in this inconsistency compensation, we have what are called the 4 A's. Number 1, the first one, is assimilation. Number 2,
a new agent is joining your team,
is accommodation. These 2 are the major 2, but we have a third and a fourth, which I'm going to talk about. We also have what's called affirmation. And we have what's called abstraction. When you experience aversive arousal, and this happens like this. This is not something that's like really long and fleshed out in the way this lecture is. When you experience the aversive arousal and your brain goes to inconsistency compensation, it picks one of these 4 to try to square this process up. Because again, it wants to get back to equilibrium. It wants to know that it's safe. So when you walked outside and you saw that the sky was purple, and for most of you, your first thought was, am I high? Am I dreaming? Did a nuclear plant explode? Like whatever the hell it might be, right? Like something's something's funky here. What you're assuming in that moment is that your expectation that the sky is blue is true. Okay? So what you're suggesting is you're going to basically try to jam experience into your previous expectation. You're going to try to find everything you can do to explain what you're seeing by holding on to the prior schema. Right? So you might say this is an anomaly. I'm on drugs suggests that the sky is still blue. I'm only seeing it as purple because I'm on drugs. I'm dreaming is kind of this idea that like, well, that's a perfectly good explanation because the sky's still blue. And if I can decide that this is true, that it must be that I'm on drugs or something like this, then that maintains my schema that the sky is blue. Thus, I can achieve equilibrium. It makes sense to me. All of a sudden, we're good. I can move through the world. Great. I am no longer experiencing aversive arousal because I have found an explanation for that. I have engaged in assimilation as a form of inconsistency compensation to find that equilibrium. Now, I'm going to use something that's a little bit less abstract here, and we're going to talk about how this works as it relates to... I'm going to use current events here, okay? So I really encourage you guys to hang in there with me while I use current events here, because I think it's really important, because this helps understand a little bit about what's going on here. If we use an example of all the stuff that's currently happening in the United States with police brutality, you are seeing in a lot of spheres assimilation. So people have a set of expectations, and this is not all the same. Not everybody has the same expectations, but people have a certain set of expectations for what a police officer is and does. For me, growing up, as a white dude in a suburban community, with really not a lot of adversity to have to worry about, is my expectation of the police was always that they exist to keep you safe. That is what a police officer is there for. They uphold the law, they keep you safe, they're good. That was my schema of how a police officer existed. Other people have other schemas based on their experience. I'm just going to use mine here as an example. So in recent times, when you see all of the videos that are going on Twitter, and you're watching the brutality that's happening and you're witnessing it with your own eyes, there's a lot of people right now that are doing what they can. Their experience of the police, when I watch those videos, is not in alignment with my expectation is. My expectation is you keep people safe, and then I'm watching police do the opposite. That is an experience of watching that is violating my expectation of what a police officer is, thus has created a significant amount of aversive arousal for me, of anxiety. Like, oh my God, like, why is this not squaring up? And a lot of people, as their inconsistency compensation, are going into assimilation, which is basically where they're trying to maintain the idea that police officers are safe, right? Like, so if I was to assimilate in this space, what I would do is I would say something like, well, it's not all police, it's a bad apple. Because it holds in that previous expectation. Or you might even hear somebody say, these videos are rigged. These are shopped. These are doctored. These are set up. These are crisis actors. These are whatever. All of these are forms of assimilation that try to keep in mind a previously held expectation and arguably oversimplified schema of what a police officer in the United States is. This is why you see people vehemently trying to argue in certain directions, because they're trying to assimilate that. Assimilation of all of these 4 versions of inconsistency compensation is the easiest, because our brain is not taxed when it is allowed to maintain its currently simplified schemas. And you will see people fight very strongly against this arousal in this way. They will fight very strongly for their assimilation. They want their pre-existing schemas to be true, because again, if your pre-existing schema is inaccurate from an evolutionary perspective, you are thus at risk now. Now all of a sudden, I can't operate through my world in a way that's safe. Again, really, really important for us to understand this. I'm not making a political statement here. I'm just literally telling you guys, this is how the brain works. This is how some people's brains are operating as it relates to this. Whether it's right or wrong is completely outside the scope of this lecture. I'm just telling you what happens from a brain science perspective. All right, so we're going to watch. If you watch this continued stuff happening, you're going to continue to use your prior schema. I'm going to use another current event. If we talk about what's happening on Twitch with the sexual harassment and assault stuff that's going on. When people are seeing maybe somebody that they have watched and respected and enjoyed get named, they're experiencing aversive arousal, right? I have a certain set of expectations for this person that I've built. They're an entertainer, they're a streamer, they're safe, they're all these things. Now all of a sudden I'm seeing data and evidence that suggests that this is not actually the case. Thus, my experience of this streamer or person is violated. Thus, I'm experiencing aversive arousal and I'm going through inconsistency compensation. If you choose assimilation in that moment, what you're probably going to do is say something like, well, we need more evidence, or, oh, it couldn't be that person, or this person must be mistaken, or we will doubt, because we want to keep our preconceived schema of that person in check. We want to hold our expectations. People do this with events too. People might say something like, so let's say like a birthday party, for example. This doesn't have to be just like this like core underlying thing. This could be a very like newly created one. So let's say there was like a birthday party that was coming up and you had an expectation that the birthday party was going to go smoothly. And then all of a sudden you have an experience where maybe somebody at the birthday party throws a temper tantrum or freaks out, or the food doesn't arrive on time. Then all of a sudden now my experience of my birthday party is not aligning with my expectations I had for it. I'm experiencing aversive arousal. If I choose assimilation, I might say like, the caterers are assholes. They don't care about me. Or everybody's ruining this day for me. Whatever it might be, because my expectation was this was going to go smoothly. I blame others. This also works conversely. And before I move on to accommodation, I want to talk about this because this is something that most people don't readily think about, but this explains a lot of the questions I get in Twitch chat very frequently. If you have a schema about yourself or about a certain event, and you expect that the worst is going to happen, if you're a person who engages in defensive pessimism, is constantly expecting, like, you're catastrophizing everything, and you've created a set of expectations that this is going to go wrong. Let's say you have an expectation that says, my partner thinks I'm burdensome. I am burdensome to my partner. And you have an experience where your partner basically does something to show you that you are not burdensome. They listen to you, they talk to you, they show that they care. You now all of a sudden are going to experience aversive arousal because your experience of the relationship is not aligned with your expectations. If you think that your partner is going to harm you when you're vulnerable, and your experience is not that, you will still get anxious. And people don't think about this because there's still a misalignment. There's still dissonance. And so what a person will do if they're not careful and they choose assimilation, which again is the easiest one to do, people will start to look for data, or they will start to do things to self-sabotage to make it so that the person hurts them when they're vulnerable, because that will actually help them achieve equilibrium. If I feel you getting close and that violates my expectations, so I push you away, so you're not close to me anymore, my expectation is confirmed. There you go. Exactly, Mystic. Exactly. Right? So we've now created, they're trying to trick me. They're trying to hurt me. The other shoe's going to drop. This isn't actually real. They must be sleeping with somebody else. Like whatever explanation we come up with. Right? It's trying to create and hold that expectation. So if you're a person that constantly creates expectations that things will go wrong, that you will fail, that you are a burden, if you keep doing that, any experience to the contrary is going to create anxiety. And a lot of people think that it shouldn't, right? Like if I think that I'm a burden and somebody shows me that I'm not, well, that should feel good. Well, no, it isn't going to, because you've already created an expectation and a schema in your brain that your brain's trying to operate off of to achieve equilibrium. So you are going to experience anxiety when you experience something good. It's usually mind-blowing for some people when I say that. Now, in a space where you have expectation, experience doesn't align, aversive arousal, you're anxious, you have a choice of doing what's called accommodation. Accommodation is Accommodation is where we alter our expectations to make room for the new experience. This is where, when we were talking about that spectrum of simple to complex as it relates to schemas, accommodation is in the spirit of moving in that direction, to adding that complexity and nuance. So now what we're going to do is, instead of taking my expectation at face value, I am going to take my experience and stop for a second and go, maybe everything I knew about the sky needs some nuance. So when I asked you guys the second time, when I said to you, what would happen if for 2 weeks you walked outside and the sky was purple, and some of you started to say, well, I guess it's a new normal, you're accommodating. Now all of a sudden you've decided that my experience must have some validity to it. Thus, I got to change my expectation to the sky, because if I keep seeing that the sky's going to be blue and I go outside and see it's purple, it's going to stress me the fuck out. So I'm going to make sure that I change my expectation of the sky to now allow room for the fact that it could actually be purple. Also, total swear jar there. Oops. I get excited. Told you. All right. So accommodation, tequila, in some ways is a form of acceptance. It's acceptance insofar as we're allowing room for that to build our schema. We have expanded our schema such that now that thing, because again, if I can do that, if I can say, well, my expectation now is that the sky could be purple, when I have an experience of the sky being purple that now aligns with my expectation, thus reinforces that expectation, thus I have achieved equilibrium again. So assimilation is acceptance of the experience without modifying your schema, but accommodation is acceptance of the experience by modifying your schema. I would be careful with using the word acceptance there, Canuck. It's more that assimilation is a push towards acceptance of the prior expectation. It's sort of like almost in some ways a denial of the experience, or an explanation of the experience using the preconceived expectation. Whereas accommodation is adding a little bit more validity to the experience and saying, well, shit, I probably need to expand my expectations here. Right? This is why diverse representation is so deeply important, especially early on in a person's life. When you grow up in a super homogenous area like I did, it made it a lot harder for me to bust through some of my schemas as it related to a diverse group of people, because I hadn't been exposed to it until I was like 18. Whereas if you have children who are exposed to diverse representation early, they have so much cognitive flexibility that you can really help children have this amazing breadth of expectation of the world and this nuance to the way that they expect people to operate that can be really healthy for them as they grow up. And it makes moving into diverse areas and building up various progressive ideologies a lot less taxing on them, because they have the plasticity and they've built this skill. Accommodation is a skill. It's something that, Canuck, when you were talking a little bit earlier about, wanting to maintain a level of cognitive flexibility, opening yourself up to accommodation as a form of inconsistency compensation and making an effort to do that is a way that you can maintain brain plasticity growing as you grow older. But it takes more cognitive energy to do this the older you get. Again, the threshold is 30. Like once people get around 30, there was a Harvard study that showed this. Once people get to around 30, their plasticity starts to plateau for a while before it dips. So all that does is it just means more effort is required in order to accommodate, as opposed to when you're a child. When you're a child, you're accommodating constantly accommodating. Their children are building these new expectations of the world in this really inductive and fun and amazing way, and adults are often the ones that jam them out of that. Adults are the ones that usually use their assimilation to box a kid in, because then when the kid starts to talk about things and align with things in a way that fits the parents' assimilation expectations. I mean, so Trek, I love you, man, but like, here's the thing. You can call bullshit on you all you want, but there's so much science that goes into it. It's like, this is not an indictment on old people. Like, you are just biologically, as a child, infinitely more plastic and flexible than you are when you're old. Like, it's not even a question. And this is not an indictment on old people. This isn't saying you can't do it. It's saying that it takes more cognitive effort to do this as you get older. If you practice this through your years, it's going to take less energy than it might somebody else who hasn't done this. but it's still going to take more energy relative to when you're growing up. Again, I have to make that point because I think it's important for us to understand that, because it means that I, as a 30-year-old, may think that I have the same level of plasticity that I might have had when I was 15, but I don't. I just don't. And I have to know that, because I have to then start making decisions about when I am presented with experiences that do not align with my expectations that have been built over time. It's going to take me more effort to accommodate, but that's why I have to know. I got to practice that. I got to keep doing that. And that goes for everybody here. You want to practice this. Accommodation is, for all intents and purposes, the better form of inconsistency compensation, because what it does is it diversifies and adds complexity to your schemas, thus giving you a more nuanced way of operating within the world, but in a way that is still comfortable for you because you've made an effort to do that. Again, just to walk through it again. You have an expectation. Your experience misaligns with it. You experience anxiety through aversive arousal. And what you do when you accommodate is you say, you know what? I need to look at these expectations. I maybe need to change them a little bit. This is why people who expose themselves to a variety of perspectives on things often move through the world in a little bit of an anxious and reactive way, because they understand that there is nuance to things. This is why you guys rarely see me get reactive to things. As a therapist, you kind of inherently have to do this. And it's important to remember that the more your expectations and your schemas are reinforced, the harder they're going to be to change. Like, the harder they're going to be to add nuance to, because they've been reinforced over time. What I guess I'm saying, the subtext of what I'm saying here to everybody who's watching this right now is, be open to changing your expectations about things. Just be open to it. Because it's going to allow you to move through the world in a little bit more of a nuanced and understanding and progressive way. I'm not talking progressive in like a political sense. I mean progressive in terms of like evolving and learning and maturing. So, affirmation and abstraction, I just want to let you guys know that these two things can be used as like a nuanced version of these two. What we're going to do with affirmation, for those of you, when I gave the example of the sky earlier, for those of you that's, I think I saw like one or two people said I would go and talk to a friend, or I would maybe ask somebody what's going on. If you walked outside and the sky was purple, if there was somebody else out there, you might look at them and say, hey, is the sky purple to you? What we're doing is we're seeking, is when we seek social confirmation for either the pre-existing expectation we had or for the experience that we're having. Now remember that most people, it's easier to seek affirmation in the context of assimilation. So what most people are going to do when they ask that question of, do you see the sky right now? They're really hoping that the person next to you is going to say, no, sky's blue. Because that's going to allow them to hold on to that previously held schema. And then it's going to give them something. They're going to say, well, I have to address my experience then. Okay, so whatever's going on, it's with me. But okay, thank God, sky's still blue. Something's messed up on my end. Some other people may find that distressing. But ultimately, we want social affirmation. We're social beings. So we might seek reassurance for those existing things. This is why people enter echo chambers on the internet or otherwise. They want affirmation for their expectations. They want to find people who have like-minded expectations, because those people do not force them to change those expectations, thus calling for the flexibility that's needed in order to accommodate. So when you see a certain issue presented, let's say on social media or something like that, you hear about something, and it's like who do you go to? What kind of information do you seek out? Because if you seek affirmation for your expectation, you're going to go one way. If you seek affirmation for your experience, you may go a different way. Most people are going to initially seek affirmation for their expectations. And they're going to try to find all the data they possibly can to hold that in place so that they can achieve equilibrium. They may shut out the thing that is creating the experience that isn't aligning so that they can hold their expectation. And sometimes people will do that to a point where they then are so deeply clutched to their expectations of themselves and to the world and the thing that we're talking about that getting them detangled from that is insanely difficult. Which is why you have to be very, very careful. This is to everybody watching this. You have to be very careful with consuming information that only confirms your schemas. Conversely, Ginger Snap, what you're talking about here is wanting a confirmation of experience, which that is in the spirit of accommodation. Because if a person standing next to you says, yeah, sky's purple, it's really weird. You have now gotten affirmation for your experience, and you may better be able to use that to recalibrate your expectation. Oof, I'm not alone. Thank God. Other people are having this experience too. So maybe it is possible that the sky is purple. This is why it is so important when you see certain movements, one person says something, and then there's more people that come forward and talk about the same thing. Because now all of a sudden we see an alignment of experiences. It makes it easier for us to change our expectations. So again, if you want to use the example of what's happening with Twitch right now, with people coming out with harassment and assault allegations, seeing more of that and people joining in talking about their stories is in an effort to get people to change their expectations of the industry and of what people in positions of power in the industry are capable of. It makes it easier for you to change your expectations if all of a sudden you're seeing a whole bunch of affirmation for experiences that misalign with your expectations. And this is also what happens on forums like subreddits. That is correct, Patricky. Yes. We often are going to look for people who have either the same set of expectations or the same experience of us. Now, you got to be careful, because if you seek out people who are having similar experiences that reaffirm an oversimplified schema, now we're getting into some very intense complexity. The ultimate goal, if there's nothing you take away from this lecture, the ultimate goal is we want to add nuance and context, and we want to expand our expectations of pretty much everything we can, especially human relationships, because that is what's going to create resiliency. It's going to create a sense of safety, and it's going to create a wider equilibrium that makes life easier to work through. If you don't do that, that's where people pigeonhole themselves so deeply into these tiny little groups, because it's just too damn scary to expand their expectations. I have to have constant affirmation of my expectations and of my experience that only aligns with that expectation. I have to have that reinforcement, because the suggestions to the otherwise are just intolerable to me. Really dangerous spiral to get in. You don't want to be there. Finally, and this one is a little bit, I don't want to call it trickier, but abstraction is something that most children can't quite do very well. But abstraction is basically understanding this one's a little bit tricky to explain. Understanding complex relationships and patterns through interactions in the environment. Abstraction is where you may have gone just absolutely out into left field with your explanation in the effort to assimilate. So if you're a person who said, like, aliens created the purple sky, that's a form of abstraction that has reinforced an assimilative inconsistency compensation. It's trying to deduce what's happening by connecting things in a very abstract way in an effort to change the expectation or reinforce the expectation. Yeah, Arch, that's a great example. Yes, using imagination to bridge the gap between your understanding and the unknown. That's a beautiful way to put it. Yes. Adults tend to be a little bit more capable of this and will go to ridiculous lengths sometimes. Mick talked about the sky being purple, and now it is a beautiful example, Trek Nerd. A beautiful example. You would make some abstract connection that it must have been me. Oh man, that's a great example. Conspiracy theories are a great example of this. Yes. And what's funny about that coffee time, when you say 4 and 5-year-olds are masters of abstraction, they're not so much masters of abstraction so much as they're just like inductively trying to create certain relationships. It's an abstract process, but it's sort of fascinating because they don't have the actual like cognitive capacity to create abstract, complex, manipulated relationships in their mind in the way that an adult can. Like an adult can think so hypothetically about so many things, whereas a child is going to just try to combine different things through like imagination and stuff, but it's in this very simplified way. It's really fascinating stuff how children do that. It's kind of their ways of trying to get the synapses together to form relationships between things. But they do it in this like beautifully simple way that I love watching. Whereas adults get into this really messy, like not only is it about these abstract patterns, it's about the perceived consequences and the reactions to those consequences and how it affects certain other things. And we borrow on too many abstract ideas and we create these explanations and we go really bananas with it. Whereas a child's not going to quite do that because they don't have the cognitive capacity to do that. They don't have the prefrontal cortex developed enough to be able to do that. Like the thing to remember about this, guys, is generally you're doing one of these two things. You are generally going to experience anxiety and aversive arousal when these two things don't align, and you have a choice that's presented in front of you of do I assimilate or do I accommodate as a way to understand this experience and move forward. The way in which you do that may be through like affirmation or abstraction, but ultimately you're going to do one of these two things. So I would ask with any of those what if questions, what is it in the spirit of? Is it in the spirit of trying to alter your expectations to such a way that actually makes room or accommodates for your experience? Or are you doing it to try to reaffirm your expectations to deny the experience is happening? And that's when you know whether you are accommodating or assimilating. Oh, I forgot to mention, aversive arousal is also called disequilibrium. So if you want to see a pattern here, right? This our brain hates, this our brain loves. We're trying to move in that direction. I love this stuff, man. Because what it does is it shows how people move through transitions when they have new information or if they have an experience that hits them. What a lot of people will do interactionally is they will try to deny a person's experience by using their expectations of something. This is where we have to be real careful interactionally. If a person tells you that they're having a certain experience or have had a certain experience and it misaligns with your expectation of the thing that they're talking about, they are in some ways, by sharing that experience, are asking you to either assimilate or accommodate. If you assimilate, there's a good chance you may deny their experience or you may question it. If you accommodate, it means, holy shit, maybe my expectation of this thing is a little bit too boxed in. I ought to listen to this person. Not because I have to necessarily take everything they say at face value, but because their experience misaligns with an expectation that I have, and that's very interesting to me. This is where we have to confront our own biases and our own agendas and the way that we are showing up in various conversations and interactions. How do you trust that you've given some consideration to your own experiences or perspective? I think by giving it time, by really listening to your experiences, by paying attention to what your expectations are. I think it's really important, Mars, for us to know what our expectations are and to be constantly evaluating them. Asking ourselves, when I've constructed a certain set of expectations, how is this going to impact what I may experience? Am I going to start searching for a limited amount of experiences to fit these expectations as a result? And am I missing out on a bunch of experiences as the result of my inability or lack of desire to change my expectations? That very well could happen. And if you're okay with that and you want to make peace with that and say, you know what, I'm fine with my limited expectations, then you have to accept the consequences of that. That you may have experiences that misalign with that, and there may be consequences as a result, and you gotta own it. You can't say I want to be rigid in my expectations and then expect other things and expect that all experiences are going to align with it and that people are going to constantly accommodate your expectations. It's an unrealistic way to move through human relationships. I do realize that talking about trauma can sometimes be really difficult for people that have trauma in their lives, but I'm not doing this in a way of like talking about specific traumas that a person would experience. I'm just talking about trauma through this framework. So if you're kind of like on edge and you're worrying like, oh my God, what is he going to talk about? I'm literally just going to talk about kind of how this fits. I'm not going to go into like what specific traumas a person may experience. So trauma is basically, I'm going to write trauma up here so people know what I'm talking about as they come in. So here's how trauma happens from this perspective. So you have your set of expectation. This is often, not always, includes some expectation of safety in general, okay? Safety is usually involved within whatever set of expectations we're having. So we have an expectation. Then we have, also safety and control. Control is also part of it. Most of us tend to have some expectation that we in general will be safe and in control of the things we can control. Then we have an experience. Now, the important point to remember about this, what's probably going to constitute a trauma, is that experience, how do I want to draw this? Is what we would call a gross violation of the expectation, which includes loss of control and a perception, whether real or not, of danger. And the operative word here, operative words, is gross violation. What this then often leads to an inconsistency compensation that fails to achieve equilibrium. And what a lot of people do is they will attempt, this is kind of separate here. A lot of people will attempt, what a lot of people will do is they will try to attempt to jam their traumatic experience into a pre-trauma expectation. And that is where we see the failure to achieve equilibrium, because the gross violation of the person's expectation makes it almost impossible to achieve that pre-trauma expectation. And people keep doing this over and over, wanting the expectation they had prior to the trauma event to be true, and in a lot of ways will re-traumatize themselves in doing so. And this happens in some ways automatically. This isn't something that a person necessarily chooses to do. So here's how this works. A person has an expectation. Let's say I'm going to be safe. I'm going to speak very generally here, okay? I'm in my home right now. I am safe and I am in control of my environment. Let's say that something happened in my apartment that violated that. Like I got assaulted in some way. Somebody broke in, something like that. My experience of my home and of my sense of control and my safety has been grossly violated. I lost my control. I perceived danger, whether I was in danger or not. Perceived is a very important word there. All right. What I may do, because I want to keep in mind, and most humans do this, I want to maintain the fact that I am safe and I am in control. What I may do is I may misplace that control. I may now create an expectation that says, it was my fault. I let that happen. I left the door unlocked. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't hear the noise. I should have done whatever. And a lot of people who've experienced trauma will go through this process. That expectation was, I am in control of my domain. But with trauma, control is taken away. Like, I could have done X. That's exactly right. In most cases, when people say that, it's not true. If somebody barged down my door right now and came into my apartment and assaulted me, there's nothing I was going to do that was going to prevent that. All right. That was out of my control. It was literally out of my control. My control was taken away. Most of us don't like the idea of having to accommodate into a space that suggests that maybe I am not always in control. It's a very unsettling thing for people to experience. Most of us want to have a very nice equilibrium built around safety and control. And when that gets violated in such a way that it's impossible for us to go back to it, you can't go back to being I'm purely safe and in control at all times because I've now had an experience that tells me that is absolutely not true. Now all of a sudden we have to reconstruct a new story. And that story is a very delicate thing for a person who has gone through a trauma to talk about and to explain and to build. Because what it has to do is accommodate in some ways for the experience that a trauma can happen to you. Now, sometimes when people experience trauma, they go a little bit too far with the expectations they create, which is they say, this will always happen to me. It's a form of vigilance. It's kind of the way that the brain says, you know what? If that could happen one time, it can happen every time. And that's where sometimes you see PTSD, OCD type stuff will emerge because a person is basically now saying, I'm never in control. They go in the opposite direction and create an oversimplified schema or expectation in compensation for that harm that they experienced. So now instead of this overly simplified, I'm always in control, we have the overly simplified, I'm never in control. And that creates problems too, because then a person's going to look for experiences that align with that. And they may be re-traumatized through various triggers that may not actually be triggering if they do some work on the trauma. So what we want to help people do is move post-trauma into a space where they can sort of integrate that trauma experience into building a realistic set of expectations that they can have for the world and for themselves, so that they can operate in such a way that keeps in mind that trauma could happen and that the certain thing that did happen absolutely is possible, but that it may also not happen because there are steps that you have taken in order to ensure that that safety is there and that you are carrying around a level of safety that you generally can enjoy by virtue of, for example, here living in the United States or whatever. And that's really hard for people to do because of the way in which the brain is affected when a trauma happens, and that's very individual for a person. Like there's no group of people experience trauma in the exact same way and compensate for the trauma in the same way, but this model that we have here that I've written out is kind of a way to understand this. And so if a person then comes out and talks about their experience of the trauma and is seeking affirmation for their experience and is met with skepticism or is met with hostility, that it also can re-traumatize a person and create problems because they're trying to integrate, they're trying to get it out there, they're trying to make sense of their experience, and they are being hit with a certain level of expectation that you should have been in control, or they might be hit with the you weren't in control, and depending on where they're at with the simplified schema, it can really cause a fear response and re-traumatize and do all sorts of stuff like that. This stuff gets tricky. Like this topic right here is a huge wormhole, because then we get into like talking about trauma and stuff and all that, and I don't have time to go that deep into it, but I wanted to make sure that based on what we learned a little while ago when we were talking about this model, I wanted to make sure that people understand the way that trauma fits into this, because a lot of people who experience trauma would tell you that this fits kind of the way that they've gone through that. And that re-traumatization of, sometimes people will deny the experience entirely. That's where we get like things like repression, or they're told interactionally to deny their experience, and they will repress it because then it can hold that expectation. I'm in control. Right? And we see sometimes people overcompensate as a result of that. For an example, I'm just going to use a quick example again, not going to go too deep, but I do want to use it as an example because it's a really common one. When people experience a form of sexual trauma, they see a loss of control as it relates to a sexual engagement, sometimes what you'll see, if it gets repressed, is an overcompensation of either having absolutely no sex and shutting everything down because there's control there, right? It revisits, I have control, and this is the way I exercise that control. Or sometimes people will go in the direction of having a lot of sex because then it's like, well, if I'm going to have sex, then it has to be in my control at all times. I am always going to initiate. I'm going to have a lot of it. And those are ways that people overcompensate as a result of trying to continue a pre-trauma expectation that they have. This is really hard when people have pre-verbal trauma, because then they don't have language for what that set of expectations was, but they still feel themselves trying to jam back to it. That's where this gets really complicated. That's just another example I want to use. What are the tools educators or others can use when a student expresses a traumatic experience to not re-traumatize? Listen. If a student comes to you and says something like that, listening to their experience and saying something like, I really appreciate that you told me, like, let's work together to figure out a plan for how we can get you some help with this, is the best thing you can do. You absolutely never want to deny the experience. You don't have to take a side. You can just listen. I really appreciate that you told me. And this goes really for anybody here, not just educators. Like, thank you for telling me. I hear you. I hear your experience. And your experience is valid, whatever it may be. The circumstances around it, like, may be more complicated, but your experience is valid and I'm listening. And then asking them, how can I assist? You know how I can assist. And if not, in a school setting, you might say, let's go talk to the school guidance counselor. Let's figure out how we can find an outlet for you to be able to chat about this and do some work around it so that you're safe and that we're handling this in an effective way. But as I've said in, so many different ways, like, when people come and talk about their trauma, it's not our job to be the judge, jury, or executioner on any of it. It's our job to listen to it and create space for it. And if you're not a professional, you don't have to handle it as a professional. You don't have to act like a therapist. You don't have to talk to a person about their trauma and uncover it and ask a bunch of questions. A lot of people, when they talk about trauma, they get asked a lot of questions, and that can be re-traumatizing because it puts pressure on them to have to kind of relive the experience. It's mostly just, hey, to whatever extent you want to talk about it, I'm here. You can tell me what's going on, and we can help figure it out. I hope that makes sense, Troy. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, here's the thing, guys. I know it's really hard to listen to a person and feel like there's nothing you can do. But when it comes to trauma, there's not much you can do. That's why there are trauma specialists. That's why there are professionals who have learned about trauma, know how to conceptualize it, know how to use it to help a person move through it. Be very careful with trauma. Oftentimes what happens when people come to others with trauma is they're confronted with their own sense of helplessness. They're confronted with this sense of, I don't know what to do and I can't help. And you never want to make that person's problem. Like, you never want to have somebody come up to you and say, oh, okay, I had this really horrible thing happen to me. I need to just talk about it. And then you make your anxiety about the fact that they just told you that their problem. Because that is like, oof. You want to stay far, far away from that. If you can't hear it, if you're not in a place to hear it, you can say, like, hey, I just want to give you a heads up. I don't know that I'm a good person to talk to about this, not because I don't care, but because it's going to stir up too much for me and I don't want to make that your problem. You can set boundaries if you need to. That is better than saying to a person, yeah, go ahead and tell me, and then reacting with your own anxiety and shoving that on the person after they told you. Do not ever open yourself up to that conversation unless you are actually ready to hear what they have to say and listen. Thanks for watching this. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned something from it. Feel free to ask me questions on stream or in YouTube comments or whatever if you have more follow-ups on it. But I'm really glad that so many of you came out to listen to this and to hear it.